Maggie G did her doctorate on Virginia Woolf, Samuel Beckett, and Vladimir Nabokov, and in 2015 published her 14th book, Virginia Woolf in Manhattan, a novel which brought Virginia Woolf back to life in Manhattan and Istanbul in the 21st century, setting Bloomsbury literary and social values side by side with those of our modern world. In 2012, there was an international conference about G's work at St. Andrews University, Scotland. In 2014, Professor Mina Özyurt-Kılıç's book, Maggie G, Writing the Condition of England, was published by Bloomsbury Academic. G has published 15 books, including The Ice People, My Cleaner, The White Family, shortlisted for the International Impact and Women's Prize, and most recently Blood, which was on the Sunday Times Best Literary Novels 2019's list. Hilary Mantel comments on Blood as such an astonishing book, funny and fierce, written with style and dash, without fear. She has been translated into 15 languages and has been warning against climate change in her fiction since Where Are the Snows? She is professor of creative writing at Bath Spa University. The Red Children, a fable about climate change set in the future, is forthcoming from Saki in January 2022. We're with you, Maggie.
Thank you, Azime, for that introduction. And thank you to Ankara Science University, Ankara Bilim University, for inviting me to talk to this symposium, which honors Virginia Woolf. It's a special pleasure to be here in this first session alongside Professor Mina Özyurt-Kılıç, whose book-length study of my work was so good that it taught me things about my novels that I didn't know myself, and with Claire Morgan, a novelist whose work, like mine, had genius of Virginia Woolf. I wish we really were all together in Turkey today, and I say this to your students as well. I'm here as a lover and critic of Woolf, but also, as Azime has told you, as the author of Virginia Woolf in Manhattan, a novel which brings Virginia Woolf back to life as a 21st century character. My fictional Virginia is reborn in the new public library in Manhattan, New York, and is last seen at a fictional International Virginia Woolf conference in Istanbul. To get there, my Virginia flies for the very first time in a plane and loves it. Just as in real life, in 1906, as a very young woman, about the age some of the listeners are today, she loved her first sight of Istanbul, which she called Constantinople, arriving there in the early morning by boat. I, by contrast, had to use Zoom this time to come to Turkey. Zoom was not quite so delightful, but all in a flash, as if flying, to quote Woolf. I'm still excited and happy to be here among Turks, who I knew are such great lovers and critics of English literature. Woolf presents a challenge to critics, teachers, and students because there's such a range of work. Novels, short stories, diaries, essays, the creative non-fiction like A Room of One's Own, which every young woman and every young man should read, and Three Guineas, and within those, such a range of life. My title for my paper today is Virginia Woolf, a female genius to whom nothing was alien. And that was inspired by a quote, Homo sum, humani nihil a me alienum puto, a Latin quotation from Terentius Afer, who the British call Terence, over 2,000 years ago in the 2nd century BC. Terence was one of the many outsiders who made up the Roman Empire, maybe a Berber, an Arab, or a Libyan, a freed slave who knew from that experience that every human being deserves to be seen, deserves to be known. Some people, like Terence, live and live on outside the place and time they were born into. Virginia Woolf was one of them. Perhaps Woolf went even further because she was not a man, but a woman who could also imagine herself inside the skin of a man. Her imagination was androgynous. In each of us, two powers preside, one male, one female, she wrote in A Room of One's Own, and demonstrated in Orlando with its playful, time-traveling hero/heroine. But it went beyond that. She could also see life from the vantage point of the roots of grass, of red ants, of a fish, among water lily stems, of wood or of a small snail on the wall that has been misseen as the head of a nail, as Professor Mine Özyurt-Kılıç will remind us shortly in her brilliant discussion of one of Woolf's early short stories, The Mark on the Wall, which made me read that story again. Woolf can smell life through the senses of a dog, as she does in the imaginary biography of the poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning's spaniel, Flush. Dog lovers should read that one too. Taken to Italy by his mistress, the dog wanders off into the streets of Florence to enjoy the rapture, nosing his way from smell to smell, the rough, the smooth, the dark, the golden, going in and out, up and down, where they beat brass, where they bake bread, where the women sit combing their hair, where the bird cages are piled high on the causeway, where the wine spills itself in dark red stains on the pavement, where the leather smells and harness and garlic, where cloth is beaten, where vine leaves tremble. Let's imagine Virginia Woolf is talking to Terence and also to us across the centuries. I think I hear her say, I am a woman. No living consciousness is alien to me. For today, the title of this conference, A Female Genius of Modernity, has sharpened our focus. Why is she a genius? Why is she important to women and girls as a female genius, and to boys, I would suggest? From my own point of view, as a female novelist, how did the modernity of her genius inspire me to write a novel, Virginia Woolf in Manhattan, which brought Virginia Woolf back to life in my own century, our century? My premise is genius means originality and independence, an ability to think new thoughts, do new things, and change the direction of an art or science. I associate genius with wit, surprise, and a degree of disruptiveness in children and in students. As teachers, I believe it is something we must look out for among those we teach. We mustn't be afraid of it. Genius is challenging. And there are terrible dangers in being different. When unvisited by luck, when unsupported by power or money, the path of genius through the world is stony. Great originality can seem merely odd to more conformist human beings. Look at the fate of Vincent van Gogh, who sold only 2 paintings and a few drawings in his lifetime. And afterwards, of course, his paintings are more valuable than any other painter. Now consider Woolf. She was a woman who wrote and thought differently. A beautiful but very odd woman. Her husband, Leonard Woolf, wrote that the crowd in the street would go into fits of laughter at the sight of Virginia. A woman without children at a period when all women had to have children, which is different now. A woman who, though married, had love affairs with other women. Let's be grateful then that Virginia Woolf was protected by her birth into intellectual aristocracy. Without that luck, she asked herself, would she ever have been so sublimely confident? Would her work ever have achieved such currency? As the first in my family to be a professional literary writer, from the first generation in my family to go to university, I am still grateful for Woolf's luck in being the daughter of the leading male intellectual of his day. Her father, Leslie Stephen, was editor of the Dictionary of National Biography, was related by marriage to the great Victorian novelist William Thackeray, and friend of all the leading writers in his day. In my novel, I sometimes tease my fictional Virginia for unconscious social snobbery, which she was guilty of. But I also see that because of her inherited privilege, which protected her, she in turn could be a role model for so many later women writers, showing us how to dare everything to make new work. And in her essay, Professions for Women, she credited the women before her, Aphra Behn, Jane Austen, George Eliot, for having been before me, making the path smooth. Her monumental courage shields us from fear of the freezing winds of male critique. So being an insider protected her, but I'm sure her originality also benefited from the unfair restrictions her time placed upon her, which made her an outsider as well as an insider. She raged at not being taught Greek like her brothers, who as boys were allowed to go to public school and to Cambridge, but her lack of university education surely helps account for some of the wonderful freedom of her critical essays and reviews and the popular personal voice she uses there, so near to speech, so full of fun and feeling. I hasten to add, to those of us who don't have a magnificent library at home like Virginia Woolf, you definitely probably do need university education to have a full range of reading. But there's a freedom about Woolf that I think is the freedom of great self-education. I hope anyone here today at this webinar who feels marginalized by something that sets them apart from the norm, whether that is cultural or personal, whether it's a disability or a special quality, will reflect that that difference can also be a source of immense strength and creativity, and was for Virginia Woolf. Perhaps in a sense, as a woman living in the first decades of the 20th century, she too, like Terence, was a freed slave. And she didn't let herself be limited by the restrictions on women. Like Elena Ferrante's character, Lila, working class character, who taught herself Greek when she couldn't afford high school in My Brilliant Friend, Woolf had herself home tutored in Greek and Latin from 15 onwards. After her lessons with Janet Case, she was able to write with originality and subtlety about classical literature in essays like On Not Knowing Greek. You see the different perspective which her independent study gave her, as she brings to life, for example, the gap between the way the plays of Euripides and Aeschylus were written to be performed, experienced communally on a hillside, she says, in the sunshine, and the way modern readers half glimpse them, reading the text indoors in solitude. Through teaching a class, which she did, a lot of people aren't aware of this, Virginia Woolf taught, didn't enjoy it, at Morley College for Working Men and Women. She also passed on her deep and wide self-education to other women, particularly working class ones. She's important to women and girls, to all of us today, partly because she gives us a model of a woman who saw, supported, and reviewed other women. And that's something we can all do. So here was my female genius, the one who inspired me ever since I was 17. I was 17 when I read Jacob's Room, her short early novel, and it seemed like nothing I'd read before. More like the thrilling shiver of life as I myself experienced it, more surprising, more puzzling than other books. Why, half a century later, did I put her into a novel about my own time? I can only say, once I had the idea, which came to me in the New York Public Library, but could have come to me on a bus, probably. It took shape quickly and seemed like a perfectly natural thing to do. Genius, I have said, allows its possessor to live outside and beyond the preconceptions of their time. And in so many ways, Virginia Woolf always belonged to our time. Her fluid sexuality looks very modern today, with our new acceptance of LGBTQ identity. She loved modernity in its most obvious manifestations, though I know Professor Özyurt-Kılıç is going to say something about slow time. Virginia Woolf loved riding in Leonard and Virginia's first motor car. You will see me take the wheel. It's an awesome sight, she wrote in a letter to her sister Vanessa. She loved new patterns in clothes and furniture. She did her best to live without servants, longing for the freedom that would bring, but never quite managing to achieve it. She wrote with passion and desire about flying and about going to America, though she never did either of those things. That is, until I wrote Virginia Woolf in Manhattan, where the fictional Virginia triumphantly achieves both feats. I also wrote Virginia Woolf in Manhattan to set her modernist approach to literature and writing against our own commercialized one, exploring what she might think of the modern bestseller, of bookshops closing, of the internet, of our fetishization of first editions like her own, sold for vast prices as luxury objects, not as speaking mouths by antiquarian booksellers. This seemed appropriate and also good fun because Virginia and Leonard were publishers as well as writers. My colleague, Professor Özyurt-Kılıç, will soon be talking to us about the real-life genesis of the Hogarth Press, the publishing house that Leonard and Virginia started, where Virginia did that most modern of things, she self-published. Anyone who tells you there is shame in self-publishing, just quote Virginia Woolf. She will explore, Mine Özyurt-Kılıç will explore in depth most of the implications of that radical choice. But I'm just going to briefly cite a few achievements of Virginia and Leonard as publishers. They published the first book in English by a Kikuyu writer from Kenya, a Black writer from the colonies. They published several important anti-imperial books. They published the works of the founder of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, a huge undertaking which they couldn't have entirely known would become a central text, an opinion-forming, knowledge-forming text of the 20th and 21st centuries. They showed their modernity, in other words, by publishing revolutionary books by outsiders. Later this week, I'm giving the first paper at a conference of the International Authors Federation, the body which represents writers at the copyright arm of the United Nations in Geneva. I'll be using the example of Virginia Woolf when I talk about the long struggle for power between writers and publishers, and consider how publishers can serve literature rather than exploiting writers. Again, Özyurt-Kılıç will explain how by becoming a publisher and working in the press herself, setting up type by hand, Virginia Woolf found happiness in becoming a physical, manual worker and maker. In one of her last 2 diary entries, she wrote this: "Occupation is essential. Haddock and sausage meat. One gains a certain hold on sausage and haddock by writing them down. Oh dear, yes, I will conquer this mood. Now to cook the haddock." That's how Virginia Woolf, the damaged, dauntless female genius of modernity we honour today, made a last gallant and entirely practical attempt to hold on to life, even as she prepared to leave it. At the most fundamental level, my novel was written to say Virginia Woolf is still alive among us today. I'm going to read a very, very short passage, paragraph really, at the very end of my novel, when Virginia is addressing a fictional international Virginia Woolf conference in Istanbul, just as we today are addressing an international seminar on Virginia Woolf in Ankara, Turkey. So back to Virginia Woolf and back to that fictional conference. Most of the young Turkish women and men, students and academics at the conference, have been unaware that, I should explain, that their literary heroine is actually in the audience, listening, bemused by some of what's being said about her. But at last, her identity is revealed. Reading begins. The sunlight pinned her to her seat. Her face was like a photograph, the sun so sharp, she was black and white. The whispers darted around like birds. It's her. Yes, Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf is in the house. And the room fell silent at last for her. This was the room she owned and ruled. You are my readers. Thank you, friends. Some of you readers who would be writers. You are the minds I spoke about, the writers of 100 years hence. What do I have to say to you? Who is to say what I would have written without my father, without servants? What would I have written without money, £500 and a room of my own? But I tell you this, I would have written. Somehow I would have found my voice, and so must you, and so will you. The light is on you. It is in this room. You are in the sunshine, which, while it's here, feels as though it will last forever. There is only one kind of luck for writers. There is the room, the sunlit room. I entered in the early morning. Before my evening, I had flown again. Write while you're here. Write while you can. Write for your time and for each other.
Well, thank you very much, Maggie. It was great. And we will take questions at the end of our webinar. So now I would like to introduce our second speaker, Özyurt-Kılıç. Mine Özyurt-Kılıç is a professor of English literature at the Social Sciences University of Ankara, Turkey. She is a fellow of Higher Education Academy, UK, and a research associate at the Empathy and Writing Research Group at Spa University. Her research mostly focuses on contemporary British fiction with special interest in women and writing. She has published on George Orwell, Angela Carter, Iris Murdoch, Pat Barker, Salman Rushdie, Margaret Atwood, Hanif Kureishi, Janet Winterson, and Edna O'Brien. Özyurt-Kılıç is the author of the first book-length study on Maggie G's fiction, Maggie G, Writing the Condition of England. She is the co-organizer of a Press of One's Own, celebrating 100 years of Hoggard Press at Harvard University in 2017, an event which included a seminar and a 2-module letterpress workshop, as well as an exhibition of selected Hogarth titles at the Houghton Library. Her paper investigates the nuances of the senile motif in Woolf's work, including the mark on the wall and Kew Gardens, and links it to the aesthetics of the Hoggard Press. The floor is yours, Mine Hoca.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your invitation to this exciting event, exciting webinar. I'm very happy to be with, literally among Professor Maggie G and Professor Claire Morgan. Thank you very much, Azime. I want to thank Bilim University, my colleagues, my students, friends, family, dear all. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this sunlit room of Ankara Bilim University. Well, I'd like to share my screen, and I'd like to share with you my titles, yeah, and some images that will make it easier for you to follow this technical stuff my paper talks about. Well, you know that Virginia Woolf demanded, we all know, young girls, young boys and colleagues, we all know that she demanded a room of her own to write freely, and established a press of her own to publish freely. And she could become, as she put in her diary, the only woman in England free to write what she liked. Then it was above all a dream that came true. And it was in fact a birthday wish that came true. So let's take this event as her birthday celebration. Let's celebrate her birth, which gave us the light in this room, in these rooms. Okay, so a press of one's own pace is my title. Woolf and the Hogarth Press. And I'll be sharing my ideas, my ruminations upon this image of the snail, Dora Carrington's woodcut image, snail. I'll talk about briefly, my paper talks about the Hoggard Press, which was founded in 1917 by Leonard and Virginia Woolf at the Hogarth House, which was another birthday wish. And on the right-hand side, you see the Excelsior hand printing machine, not the exact one. This was in Boston, dating back to those days. And this is how Virginia and Leonard used these lead letters and compose them on a stack. Again, I'm sharing this because I'll be talking about this. See, there's a sentence in the making here. Takes a lot of time. You need to be very careful, very slow, not to make mistakes. And if you want some color on your page, so much the worse, the better. Takes more time. And a word and image get together. And finally, you print. But you need book covers. They're artist's help. curtains help, bedspreads help. The mark on the wall, the final page, and the blue thread you see in between. This is handmade and you can see it in all its moves. And the snail. Okay, let me. Show it once again. All right. Okay, I stop sharing my screen. All right. Well, to put in Woolfian terms, on or about March 1917, something changed when Virginia and Leonard Woolf, who had bought this long-desired handprinting machine, handprinting press, and placed it on their kitchen table, and began an alternative history of publishing in Britain. Hogarth, the boutique publishing house, saw not only the priceless handmade copies of Woolf's works adorned with her sister Vanessa Bell's beautifully designed covers and illustrations, but also some of the seminal texts of English modernism and the avant-garde texts by T.S. Eliot, Hope Mirrlees, Nancy Cunard. The professionalism and scope of their enterprise were far beyond their means. As amateur bookmakers, they initially used wallpapers, curtains available at home for their book covers, and bound loose papers, literally sewing them with a needle and thread. As the early Hogarth books demonstrate, the strands of blue thread left behind in the early handmade copies were, in a way, the blueprints for a firm move away not just from mechanical publishing methods, but also from the rapid and standardizing forms of modern existence. Like the snail I mentioned above, with its home on its back, the Hogarth married private and public life with a letterpress machine on a dining table, not just to create an alternative publishing house. It suggested a new pace in the way of life, of thinking, of looking, writing, reading, parallel to the change Woolf put in her famous essay, Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown. On or about December 1910, human character changed, unquote. She observed that all human relations shifted and wrote that when human relations change, there is at the same time a change in religion, conduct, politics, and literature. The impetus behind the experimental works of the early Hogarth was to grasp and record the minutiae of this change, which required an absorbed interest. The snail that makes its appearance on the first publication of the Hoggard Press, the mark on the wall, can be regarded as the very emblem of the Woolf's mission. Like Schumacher's claim for the economy, some of you might be familiar, small is beautiful. The Woolfs seem to suggest that in expressing the rapidity of life, the perpetual waste and repair, slow is beautiful. This first Woolf story published at Hogarth can be then read as a fictional manifestation of Woolf's Ars Poetica. The narrator in this story situates herself in the world she describes, understanding one truth about it, I quote, "What an airless, shallow, bold, prominent world it becomes, a world not to be lived in." And then discerns her calling in it, I quote, "I want to think quietly, calmly, spaciously, never to be interrupted, never to have to rise from my chair, to slip easily from one thing to another without any sense of hostility or obstacle. I want to sink deeper and deeper, away from the surface with its hard, separate facts," unquote. This quiet, calm, spacious, uninterrupted act of thinking is the very engine behind Woolf's modernist texts. They require a special mode of reading, deliberately slow and effortful, not effortless at all, very much like the movements of a crawling snail fictionalized in The Mark on the Wall. A central motif in the story, visually reproduced in Dora Carrington's woodcut print to accompany the text, the snail is one of the many lives that the narrator feels committed to describe in detail. I quote, "There are a million patient, watchful lives still for a tree, all over the world, in bedrooms, in ships, on the pavement, living rooms, where men and women sit after tea, smoking cigarettes. It's full of peaceful thoughts, happy thoughts. I should like to take each one separately," unquote. While the narrator attempts to describe and visualize each thought separately without haste, the text invites its reader to a rhythm that would allow him or her to attend to these images with a similarly slow pace. The story portrays the consciousness of a narrator who wants to focus, this time on one idea in the stream of consciousness, Shakespeare. As she delves deeper and deeper into the flow of Shakespeare's stream of consciousness, his thoughts, she becomes able to see the shower of ideas falling upon his stream, Shakespeare's stream. I quote, "To steady myself, let me catch hold of the first idea that passes. Shakespeare. Well, he'll do as well as another, a man who sat himself solidly in an armchair, looked into the fire, so a shower of ideas fell perpetually from some very high heaven down through his mind. He leaned his forehead on his head, people looking in through the open door, for this scene is supposed to take place on a summer's evening," unquote. This passage, with its keen interest in the contemplative inquiry, is like the first draft of the 1919 essay, Woolf's 1919 essay in Modern Fiction. I'm sure many of you could identify the exact words she repeats. She suggests a new way of writing in this essay, a new perspective that should grasp the train of thoughts that fall upon our minds and convey the spiritual rather than the material words surrounding it. And I quote from the essay just to refresh your memories. "Examine for a moment an ordinary mind on an ordinary day, maybe on a bus. The mind receives a myriad impressions, trivial, fantastic, evanescent, or engraved with the sharpness of steel. From all sides they come, an incessant shower of innumerable atoms, and as they fall, they shape themselves into the life of Monday or Tuesday," a title of her collection of short stories. For Woolf, to describe this ordinary mind, the novelist should follow the rhythm of it, often working against the chronology of clock time. Interestingly, the Shakespeare of The Mark on the Wall is visualized in contemplation, like the flame thinker in, if you're familiar, Gaston Bachelard's, the French philosopher's description in the Psychoanalysis of Fire. Bachelard in this book suggests that when a person descends into deep reverie, he or she departs from the boundaries of present time and present space. Maybe that's why we like lighting candles, through a creative mental process. And he or she produces thoughts and emotions in a state of daydreaming, musing. I quote Bachelard. "What better proof is there that the contemplation of fire brings us back to the very origins of philosophical thought?" Woolf's Shakespeare here stands as a marker of this mental state. It has a pace of its own, independent from the bounds of clock time. Mimicking Shakespeare, the narrator focuses her creative energy on the snail, the very mark on the wall. Woolf portrays the narrator's mind at work, trying to identify the mark in tune with the pace of the snail. This mimetic technique wonderfully reflects Woolf's production of the text through letter printing, which consisted of identifying small lead letters, placing them in a frame in order to make the correct syllables first, words then sentences, paragraphs with correct spaces and punctuation marks. In his interview, The Incredible Need to Create, the printmaster Ted Ollier describes the labor and care required in the process of letter printing. I quote the master. Anyone looking to print a book would typeset the text in chunks, print them in sets, slowly work their way through the book, reusing letters from previous pages as they proceeded, if they have enough letters, of course. If not, the story should end. It becomes even more complicated when you realize that printed text that is intended for binding into a book is not laid out in page order, like 1, 2, 3, 4. The pages have to be divided up, imposed into signatures that make it easier to print and bind. So page numbers follow 8, 1, 2, 7, 6, 3, 4, 5. So you need to be very careful. You may wish to decide your page breaks and page flow before you even start laying lead into a composing stick. So, Woolf found this idea challenging, fascinating. And in her letters, Woolf describes this work as tremendous fun. So she's a genius. What is a big challenge? What is a big trouble was tremendous fun for her. She joyfully repeats the terms throughout the diary, in describing the Hoggard Press, absorbed to describe the full concentration the printing requires. John Lehman, who worked with Woolf and served as the general manager and a partner at the Hoggard Press until 1946, also observes that for Woolf, manual labor at the Hoggard Press was particularly soothing and restoring after the heavy mental work on her novels. Lehman suggests that packing up parcels and setting the type for poems were like a quiet walk along the seashore after all the heaving and tossing. This might ring bells. Maggie, Claire. Lehman's nature metaphor particularly stresses the redeeming results of the unity between the textual and creative energies. It is very interesting to note that for an item like Kew Gardens, a short item like Kew Gardens, a story of about 2,700 words with illustrations, edition of 500 copies, the Woolfs needed about 3 working weeks full, most of which would probably have been spent printing and binding only. Obviously, for conceiving, drafting, writing, rewriting, editing, typesetting, and printing a story, then covering the volumes, making them available to the reader, Woolf almost follows the pace of the snail she fictionalizes in the story, literally turning it into a textual representation. The medium and the message, as Marshall McLuhan argues, the medium and the message act in unison to convey the absorbed idea, the very source and the product of the text. In Kew Gardens, Woolf makes a snail one of the central consciousnesses in the story. The narrative slowly follows the snail that revolves around the flower bed in Kew Gardens on a hot and humid day in July. A single figure among those visitors coming from different walks of life, the snail considers every possible method of reaching his goal, unquote. As achieved at the image of Shakespeare in The Mark on the Wall, a contemplative state is invoked through the recurrent scenes of the snail's endeavors to move. Trying to decide whether to circumvent the arch tent of a dead leaf or to breast it, the snail is represented as a symbol of slow but careful thinking. While drawing attention to the snail's mind at work, Woolf attunes the reader to the necessary slowness to capture the flow of intersecting consciousnesses in the story. I argue that Woolf's snail marks a special state of consciousness fit to attend to the illuminated moments often solidified in her use of stream of consciousness technique. Studying fictive patterns and form as compensation for life in Woolf's novels, Homestead observes that many of Woolf's patterns in Kew Gardens follows the natural design of a snail's shell, which grows in line with the growth of the snail. Woolf describes the sense of interconnectedness among time, space, and the consciousnesses in the final scene of the story, like a vast nest of Chinese boxes, all wrought steel, turning ceaselessly one after another. This Chinese box image can be read as the reiteration of the circles on a snail's shell, created as it moves. The shell includes the trace of each and every movement that it makes, that the snail makes. The snail produces new shell material, like the soft material of its protoconch, that first expands its shell and hardens. Thus, the part of the shell it was born with ends up in the center of the spiral when the snail and its shell become fully grown. It's complicated, but fun. As if to keep a record of all the moves it makes, as a snail matures, the number of whirls and spirals which its shell has increases, as do the rings that grow inside the shell. So describing the conglomeration of seemingly disparate experiences and states of being, the finale of Kew Gardens similarly accentuates the interconnection between what is outside the shell and what is inside the snail. Obviously, the Hoggard Press, which became Woolf's shell haven, where she could freely publish the products of her intellectual experiments, encompasses each and every trace Woolf made through a rich intellectual journey. Slowly, the scope of the house expanded to include Vita Sequel, Freda Utley, Edith Sitwell, literature, translations from Russian literature, from German, Rilke, Dostoevsky. In other words, Hogarth's shell grew as the creative energy in it ceaselessly moved on. The two stories then can be read in any form as verbal endorsements of the natural rhythm. The mental and bodily figures enjoy in them the early Hogarth editions with the beautiful woodcut paintings of Vanessa Bell, Dora Carrington, and they offer a rhythmic reading experience that follows the movement of the emblematic snail, stopping to relate the visual to the verbal images in the text, revising her mental images upon such poses. The reader, like the snail of Kew Gardens, climbing a leaf, climbing a page, makes the effort to experience the text and turn it into a mark on his or her shelf. Presenting books, to conclude, as aesthetic objects with beautifully decorated covers and handmade figures inspires a tempo that cultivates a deeper look into the cotton wool of everyday life. The visual and verbal images of the Hogarth snail draw attention to an eccentric, marginal and marginalized, and extraordinary vision. This vision makes something necessary. It is a reading slow enough to savor millions of surrounding lives, myriad impressions, incessant shower of innumerable atoms. Such an all-encompassing vision has the rich potential to stop all other trains of thought, focus on the moments of being, on life. As such, it offers an alternative to the fiction she challenged courageously with her genius in her essay and in her works, Modern Fiction, by rhetorically questioning, is life like this? So she gives us the life as it is. She still does that. And I believe that she's still among us. Thank you very much for listening.
Mine Hocam, thank you very much for this amazing talk. Our third speaker is Claire Morgan. Let me introduce her to you. Claire Morgan is Director of Creative Writing at Oxford University, where she's a member of the English faculty and a fellow of Kellogg College. Professor Morgan is a novelist, short story writer, and literary critic, and her novel, A Book for All and None, was shortlisted for the Authors Club Best Novel Award and reflects her interest in creating fictions around real historical characters and events, in this case, Virginia Woolf and Friedrich Nietzsche. Her book, What Poetry Brings to Business, resulted from her long-term collaboration with the Boston Consulting Group, and her recent research on the subject was featured in the Wall Street Journal and Fast Company, and is forthcoming in Humanizing Business. Floor is yours, Professor Morgan.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, and I'm so delighted to be part of this inspiring event. It's a pleasure and an honor indeed to be with you today alongside Professor Maggie G and Professor Mine Özyurt-Kılıç, whose wonderful presentations it now falls to me to follow. So I will be speaking for about 20 minutes on a lesser known aspect of Virginia Woolf's writerly development and how this came to be the focus of my novel, A Book for All and None, which, as has just been mentioned, has Virginia Woolf and Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher Nietzsche, as central characters. Now, on the 3rd of September, 1922, I'm just noting when I start so that I don't run over. On the 3rd of September 1922, Virginia Woolf recalls in her diary that it was at Manorbier, aged 21, walking the down on the edge of the sea, that the vision came to her more clearly than it had ever done before of the kind of writer she wanted to be. That vision of her writerly direction occurred, in fact, on Woolf's first visit to Manorbier on the coast of Pembrokeshire, South Wales, in February 1904, when she stayed there with her sister and 2 brothers and George Duckworth in the traumatic aftermath of her father, Leslie Stephen's, death. The nature of that vision about her writing is clarified and elaborated when she returns to Manorbier alone in the summer of 1908. And it is encapsulated in her letter to Clive Bell from the 19th of August that year, in which she tells him, "I think a great deal of my future and settle what book I am to write, how I shall reform the novel and capture multitudes of things at present fugitive, enclose the whole, and shape infinite strange shapes." The infinite strange shapes that Woolf sought to harness in the course of her art are generally seen in terms of Cornwall having pride of place as the foundational landscape of Woolf's artistic vision. And Woolf, of course, makes clear in her Sketch of the Past just how important a shaping force her childhood visits to Talland House, St. Ives were. Commentators frequently suggest that the Hebridean setting of To the Lighthouse is a more or less direct transposition of those Cornish experiences 500 miles to the north. There is, however, another intensely formative landscape for Woolf, formative in a range of ways, which I'm going to share with you. And it's a landscape which profoundly affected her and is profoundly at the heart of my novel, A Book for All and None, in which she is such a central focus. This is the landscape, indeed, of Pembrokeshire, South Wales, specifically around the area of the small coastal hamlet of Manorbier. Leslie Stephen's funeral took place on the 24th of February 1904, and by the 28th, Woolf is writing to Violet Dickinson from Manorbier that we have come to the right place. Right, in the sense that Leslie Stephen's death here in this quiet place seems more natural and less terrible than it did. On the 28th of February, she writes to Violet Dickinson, "I haven't seen such splendid wild country since St. Ives. We live almost under the shadow of a great feudal castle, which stands on a cliff over the sea." She goes on to tell Violet Dickinson that there are about 3 houses here. It is cold, she says, but very clear and bright, and no sound but wind and sea. Woolf developed a strong emotional connection with Manorbier. And as she is on the verge of leaving to go back to Fitzroy Square from her 1908 visit, she tells Violet Dickinson in a letter how she has settled up with her landlady. I asked her for the bill and she scratched her head and said, I shall charge you 1 egg a day. Fires cost nothing, fowls cost nothing. It has been a pleasure to serve you. And then you call me an egoist, a woman who doesn't love her kind. I think of becoming a philanthropist this winter and perfecting that side of my character, which some judge to be defective. Well, the metropolitan banter notwithstanding, we can see Woolf asking herself those very questions about human connectivity and altruism, which so centrally inform the novel that she is, on this second visit, engaged in writing. For her expressed wish to shape infinite strange shapes issues in rightly terms in 100 pages of my work of imagination, which she is then calling Melambrosia, which of course became The Voyage Out. In a letter to Emma Vaughan in the middle of August 1908, she articulates what I think is the central image of what came to be The Voyage Out, when she says, rain all day, storms at night, and such a croaking in the swamp as sends all dreams away if you sleep with your windows open. So there she is writing that on the coast of Wales, wild, beautiful, in the middle of being there on her own in 1908. The croaking of primeval creatures in the swamp is the motif at the heart of the forest scene, as many of you may recall, in The Voyage Out, where Rachel and Terence attempt to articulate their love. Their attempts at articulation mingle with and are subsumed by the creaking and croaking of the primeval forest. Inarticulacy is shown to be the condition of human affection. Communication, Woolf suggests in that forest scene, is something that occurs beyond the rational, compact, sequential, modern modes of ordinary language. Now, Manorbier, the silence, the solitude, the quality Woolf refers to several times as primitive or even barbaric, is, I want to suggest, catalytic in the imaginative development which leads to Rachel and Terence's forest scene and extends on through Woolf's preoccupation with the primitive and the civilized, which is of central creative interest to her right to the end of her life. In her second visit to Manorbier in 1908, she was staying in a house called Sea View, and she speaks of the view she has from the great bow window facing the sea, where nobody disturbs me. They light a lamp for me after dinner, and the only noises I can detect with my window open are distant sounds of cows, a blue bottle outside on the cistern, and at the moment, the flapping of a red admiral who has come in and, like all insects, can't get out. In this situation, Woolf feels herself to be in a state of perpetual movement and a border of mystery, solving the limits of fields and silencing their prose. She feels able, I would suggest, to get beyond language, just as T.S. Eliot believed Beethoven was trying to get beyond music in his later quartets. And this getting beyond language is, of course, of vital importance throughout Woolf's work, and assumes new shapes towards the end of her life when she is writing between the acts and anon. But in this early stage, 1908, getting into her first 100 pages of Melambrosia, aka The Voyage Out, this importance is just beginning to formulate. Its mode of formulation becomes apparent in her August 19th letter to Clive Bell, when she describes how there is a certain road with shadows across it leading to the sea, where Nessa and I walked, that is in her earlier visit in 1904, and she declared that romance was not a thing of the past as she had thought, but it was going on all around us. There's not time here to go into the large and interesting question of Woolf's relation to romance and indeed to romanticism. I argue in an article elsewhere that Woolf's later work is intimately connected to the neo-romantic movement in Britain, which was taking shape and substance throughout the 1930s, and had much to say about a notion of Britishness founded in an ancient Celtic authority. But what is clear is that Woolf, in these early visits to Manorbier, is in the process of discovering there a place of otherness, distanced from the usual hegemony of London existence. It's a borderland of time. Walking along the cliffs, Woolf fixes things around her with an intense gaze meant to sever them from past and future. Mystery, motion, and a reformulation of time construct in their romantic aspect a new imaginative territory for Woolf, where some little coil of brain unvisited by any blood so far and pale as wax has got a little life into it at last. It's also a borderland between individual and communal, where, as we have seen in relation to the landlady, those questions of real human connection, which underlie the possibilities of the human spirit, however ordinary and apparently insignificant, are brought directly into Woolf's imaginative focus. In her landlady's assertion that fires cost nothing, fowls cost nothing, Woolf, getting her first clear vision of her real righted erection, finds at Manorbier an aspect of imaginative borderland where the integrity of the human spirit still holds sway. At the same time, this borderland's relation to the anti-rationalism of Romance structures allows her to start experimenting, however tentatively, with new formulations of the dynamic between the human spirit and the implacable countenance of rationalist modernity. Now, these visits of Virginia Woolf to Manorbier fascinated me as a reader of Woolf. Like Maggie, I first read her in my teens and was captivated, but also as a scholar of Woolf, studying and writing about Woolf at Oxford and in a variety of formulations. And linked also with the fact that I was born and brought up in Wales. I'm here now, in fact. This is where you see me, in a very old farmhouse in Wales. And along with that, and the sort of relation of the periphery to the centre, you know, Wales to London, tied in with Woolf's interest in, as it were, the less reported moment, in the small events, not the great big apparent narratives, but what goes on in those little spaces and interstices which are less visible than the sort of major narratives of existence would cause us to think. So these visits to Manorbier are underreported. This position of this beautiful place, which of course I have visited on a number of occasions, this positioning of this landscape, in Woolf's development, fascinated me and took hold of me imaginatively, to cause me to make that 1908 visit to Manorbier by Woolf on her own, and finding a voice for her first novel of central interest. But also, when I was digging into Woolf's diaries and letters and Hermione Lee's biography of her, I was intrigued to learn at the end of this stay on her own, 2 weeks thereabouts, 2 or 3 weeks, Virginia Woolf went on a spiritual retreat. And there's also a gap in the chronology where you don't quite know where Woolf is. And that, to me, sort of all came together and it began to seem to me, the writerly side of me at least, that something had occurred in that trip to Manorbier, which had affected her deeply, caused her to want to pause and reflect upon spiritual and existential matters. And there was this aspect of sort of mystery here, which my imagination wouldn't let go of. So at the same time as this burgeoning interest and fascination with Woolf was coming along for me imaginatively, I was also very much fascinated by the influence that Woolf and other modernist writers had been subject to. And in terms of, in philosophical terms, one of the central influences of modernism is, of course, Nietzsche. As Pines and Burnham put it in Understanding Nietzsche, Understanding Modernism, Friedrich Nietzsche's vision helped lay the foundations for modernism in style, substance, and attitude. And I wanted to find out more about how this worked in terms of Woolf, you know, whether there was a specificity there. One can talk, of course, about her fascination with time and memory, clock time versus consciousness time, influences of William James in that respect. And one can talk about relativism and Nietzsche's absolute, if I can say that incorrectly, absolute relativism. But her fascination with time and memory chimes with Nietzsche's fascination with time and memory. And I took a quote from Nietzsche, used it as epigraph to my novel. Here's Nietzsche in Thus Spake Zarathustra. The present and the bygone upon earth, ah, my friends, that is my most unbearable trouble. To redeem what is past and to transform every it was into thus would I have it. That only do I call redemption. And this sort of passionate engagement on Nietzsche's part with the past seemed to start coming together in what I knew of Woolf and trying to redeem her past with her family, which she does in To the Lighthouse, and says after that she doesn't dream or have so much about her mother and those times anymore. That came into play, as did Nietzsche as a tragic figure, his ill-fated passion for the alluring and free-thinking Russian emigre, Louise von Salome. Some of you may have heard of that. Of that relationship. And I was fascinated by that. I'll speak of it very briefly, because Nietzsche in 1882 fell madly in love with Louise von Salome in Rome in the spring. He first encountered her in the Basilica, and they went together with her mother and his friend Paul Ray on a long weekend trip to Lake Orta in northern Italy, a wonderfully evocative place. And the encounters there cemented his passion for her. And in the aftermath, when she rejected him, his mental health was severely affected. As we may know, Nietzsche finally went mad in 1889 and remained so for the rest of his life. But it was at Orta, under Lou's influence, that Nietzsche felt this huge passion and started to write his great work, Thus Spake Zarathustra. It says, von Orta an, from Orta onwards. He has on his manuscript there. So I, as a writer, had two writers, Woolf and Nietzsche, two beautiful places briefly visited, Manorbier on the coast of Wales and Lake Orta in northern Italy. Two beginnings of wonderful pieces of writing, Voyage Out and Thus Spake Zarathustra. And a huge sense of a desire to link the Nietzsche and his philosophy with Woolf and what she was doing as a writer, a modernist writer, in some tangible way. So just looking at the time, I'm okay for the moment, just a couple more minutes. Imaginatively armed with these apprehensions, I set out to make manifest the relation between Woolf and Nietzsche. How? Very briefly, A Book for All and None has two scholars as central characters alongside Woolf and Nietzsche. And the scholars, Raymond Greatorex and Beatrice Copas, are in pursuit of Virginia Woolf and Nietzsche, just as I was in writing them and writing the novel. Beatrice has written a brilliant thesis on Virginia Woolf, and Raymond has just published a piece on Nietzsche called Nietzsche and the Moment, Some Observations on Time in the Work of Virginia Woolf and T.S. Eliot. So two scholars in pursuit of a writer and a philosopher, me in pursuit of all these characters, and a central challenge, how to make the novel transcend the abstract notion of a connection and come alive as a world inhabited by these characters and enterable by my readers. And I'm going to finish, if I may, with a very short reading of a portrayal of Virginia Woolf from the novel. She is in Manorbier. I've cut this section down so it will just be pretty compact. She is in Manorbier. She's on her own. It's August 1908. She's got her novel in her head. There's the moon, the ocean, the lighthouse, this tiny village. And I have her setting out from the little cottage where she's staying, walking through the village to another house to meet, well, what? Here we go. There is no one about. What a perfect night this is. The cobbled path under her feet is smooth and certain. She can just detect over the headland the rhythmic quickening as the tip of the lighthouse beam passes. The air is warm and touches her bare arm like a blessing. It is all perfection. Surely nothing can better this night. She has a basket over her arm with bread, sliced meat, cheese, and wine in it. The young girl that looks after the house and cleans for her had brought along 3 most beautifully ripe and perfect tomatoes. She has eaten one earlier in the day, and its sweetness has astounded her. She has the other 2 washed and wrapped in white paper in her basket, and there are 2 glass tumblers, all that the house has to offer, which will hold the wine. She stops to catch her breath on the first level part where the road bends left. The houses are fewer, the main part of the village has been left behind. In the stillness, she can hear the sounds of human habitation. A window squeaking on the catch, a dog barking, a man's voice calling to a woman, the woman's indistinguishable reply. From a long way below, the wail of a baby rises up, very thin and mewing. She smiles in the darkness. That cry will be for her one day. The smell of wood smoke comes up, headily accompanying it. She can see it in her mind's eye, a woman putting her child down by the firelight, tucking a woolen blanket up under its cheek. The gate squeaks as she closes it behind her, and the sound of her own footsteps on the brick path is loud. There is a light in the window, the glowing yellow haze of an oil lamp. She knows she will write about that oil lamp one day. The steps are dark, but she knows them, surely, under her feet, and climbs them confidently. What is it that comes to her then? Some sense of impending completeness. The moment itself as a circle, and she the beginning and end of its circumference. She lifts her hand to knock on the door, but it opens as if of its own volition, as if by magic. With a small exclamation that could be joy, she lifts the basket up into the 2 hands that take it from her and steps inside. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. It was wonderful. And thank you all for these amazing talks.
Thank you, Claire.
And I think we can now start Q&A session. If you have questions, please ask them via YouTube or Instagram, and I will ask them to our guests. Maybe before the audience's questions, if you have questions for each other, maybe you can ask, or if you have something to discuss and emphasize, you can comment on these issues as well. Mine Hocam, Maggie, and Claire. You're on mute.
Sorry. I would actually like to ask Claire, did she feel, as I did, there's something intimidating about writing Virginia Woolf? I mean, at least mine was a modern Virginia Woolf, but, you know, she is such a wonderful writer. And you do feel, I felt the whole Woolf scholarship would fall on my head. I mean, actually it didn't, but this is, I mean, there is a certain fear, isn't there, in imagining yourself within the head of another writer?
Oh, yes, I think absolutely. And I had to kind of get out of the scholarly and much more into the imaginative to enable me to put that to one side a little bit, and going to Manolbia and actually going into the house. I went into the room where, I mean, lots of people in Manolbia claimed this was the house where Virginia Woolf wrote, but I think I found the one where she did. And I went in and sort of could see the view and see where she wrote. And I think also the novel developed over quite a long time when I was writing something else and something not to do with Woolf. And so the dynamic of the potential interrelations between the characters sort of took over for me. And Woolf told me her story, so to speak, as Nietzsche told me his, but no stepping outside that sort of, as it were, the magic of the creative process. It is very intimidating, and also to make the links with Nietzsche, and so have two big historical characters was a challenge, but a joy.
Yes, I agree. And I'm interested because Minnie's paper was so much about Woolf and the physical, Woolf and the material, Woolf and that sense of loving that. And when you talk about going to Manolbia yourself, and I've always felt when we teach young writers, we're very often doing it all, you know, we're doing it virtually. Too many of them think that you can do all your research via Google. You simply can't, because places are wonderful and inspirational. And I found my visits to Turkey so inspirational, and my visits to New York, and listening to what people say and talking to students, talking to Mine, you know, these real experiences are what we want. We want life in books, don't we? You know, you gave us the sweetness of the red tomatoes, and suddenly we're all tasting the red tomatoes. And, you know, that's what, you know, Professor Özyurt-Kılıç, as I must call her today, you know, that's what she really emphasized in her critical scholarly work.
Yes, I felt very much the intersection with Professor Özyurt-Kılıç's paper, as well as, of course, your own in terms of place and going there, but the sort of practicality of Woolf, getting her hands dirty, and I sort of felt that practical sense, which the second talk shared with us so brilliantly, absolutely intersected with that burgeoning sense I had of Woolf on the edges, so to speak, on the geographical and cultural margins, as it would have been then, on the coast of Wales, and formulating her own sort of new method of things.
Minnie?
Well, I've been thinking about your images or your concoctions of Woolf, and I see that, and I want to ask you if that was a deliberate choice. We have, the spiritual and the material in the process of creating this Woolf, 21st century Woolf. But I see that your Woolfs are at a confluence of her feminism and writing. So we have a traveling Woolf. She has a room of her own, a press of her own, but she travels to New York, to Istanbul, to Wales, and she's on the move. And I'm fascinated by this choice. I'm situating Woolf outside in public domain as a traveling figure. Well, if you like, take mine both as an answer and a question. So would you like to comment? I mean, was this something deliberate?
Well, I think what I learned, indeed, from actually coming to, it was the University of Istanbul, and I saw how important Virginia Woolf was to Turkish students, how much she meant to the men and the women, actually. I didn't realize that, but some of the very, very good questions were from the young men. And that gave me a wonderful sense of her, her as a world writer. That, she can be narrowly defined by her class, by her appearance, but in fact, her love of freedom, I think, speaks to everyone, and her real sense that she is part of a continuum of writers, of a tradition, of course. She goes back to the classics, but always moving forward with women, always looking at the women as she does in a room of one's own, the women who can't be there, the women who are looking after children or making supper. She feels they are all linked. And that sense of freedom, and that we can all be free, we can all write, create, make, I think is the most wonderful thing that can be enjoyed in Uganda, that can be enjoyed in New York, and can be enjoyed in Turkey. That links all of us here today.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I would like to ask my own question, but if you have something to say more, Professor Morgan, you can, please.
Not at all. Please go ahead.
Okay. Well, I would like to ask my own question to Maggie G. While I'm reading Virginia Woolf in Manhattan, I'm still reading it. I feel like I'm reading Orlando by Woolf. I don't know why, because she's now again traveling, and there are also certain fluidities in the narrative. And I thought that this novel is like a picaresque novel, and which is full of adventures. And then I ask myself who the protagonist of this novel is. The eponymous Virginia Woolf character, or Angela, the scholar?
Well, they're both protagonists. Obviously, Angela is the one who, in a way, represents all of us as we look for Woolf. That searching figure, that modern figure, that figure who doesn't know what she's looking for. But I think what you say is quite profound, because Orlando, of course, the time-traveling novel, the playful novel, the fun novel, was the one whose mode and style I borrowed for this book, and was also the one that encouraged me that Woolf would have enjoyed it, perhaps herself, because she was a very playful writer and a very witty one. And I suppose, I don't like the idea of Woolf, the tragic figure, because women, creative women, don't have to be tragic. And so Orlando, which is playful and serious but playful, and which shows that through the mind and through sinking into the moment and going through the moment, we can be anywhere. So really, they're both protagonists, but Woolf has got to be, but my own Woolf, you see, my own Woolf. So I didn't have to be afraid. My Woolf.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Well, another question is that maybe I'm asking this question to you all. Woolf is generally described as a kind of item, a possession of the scholar to be researched on, but not a flesh and blood character, unlike Maggie G's novel. And in Claire Morgan's novel, A Book for All and None, we see the description of a female scholar who is doing research on Woolf. And in a way, in both novels, we see two female characters pursuing their identities as a woman, as a mother, as a scholar. So how do you comment on Woolf as a kind of possession of the scholar?
After you, Claire.
Have I, please allow me to clarify. Is the question, there was just a little blip on, with the connectivity, so I want to make sure I heard it correctly. Woolf as a possession of the scholar?
Yes, as a possession, as a research topic.
So sort of objectified into something exactly. that you research.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, gosh, that's a very, very interesting question. I suppose that the object of a scholar's research is, while that object is being researched, you know, that writer, for example, sort of becomes an object, but is reconstituted either by academic writing, or in my case and in Maggie's case, by novelistic writing. And I suppose, I think that it's very important that the commodification of Woolf, say in this instance, is not allowed to somehow dominate the genuine desire of us as human beings to reach across time, language, space, and engage with the lasting brilliance of this character, Virginia Woolf, as woman, as writer, as daughter, as friend, you know, as all those things. And I think there is a danger. I think our society, as we have it at the moment, exacerbates the danger of turning, you know, virtually everything into a commodity, and falsifying what we're looking at and examining through that commodification. For example, you know, if a certain approach is very, very fashionable in academia, and you know, one wants to be published, does one kind of jump on the bandwagon and treat Woolf in relation to that current fashionable approach because one stands a better chance of getting published, for example, rather than really digging into what it is that fascinates one as a human being and writer and thinker about the subject of our research, rather than, in the terms we're talking, the object of our research. So I think that is really something to be guarded against. Having said that, I mean, Woolf is, of course, a hugely popular, a huge figure in the sort of popular imagination. It witnessed sort of theatre about her, ballets about her. There's a rather interesting ballet that was choreographed in the last couple of years about on Woolf. So I think it's wonderful that she is celebrated in so many ways. My own view is that I'm aware of a need to absolutely, or desire on my part, and a wish for others, that they approach Woolf with integrity as a subject, as an infinitely diverse subject, rather than a containable object that they're using for their own ends. I hope that begins to answer that.
Could I link this to the way that really Özyurt-Kılıç's paper was written, and then perhaps ask her what she thinks. But obviously what writers want, what we want, is to be held and felt and loved by readers. We want readers to live with us, to feel the text, to see our memories, and to recognize themselves in the text. But I think the point of scholarship, if there is a real point, the point of university study is to make readers read deeply and profoundly. And that's why this kind of loving scholarship, and I'll ask Vinay to comment, but that is what I think is the best scholarship, and the kind of scholarship that Woolf herself did. What do you think?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I find, as this scholar here, I find Virginia Woolf very inspiring. I was 16, 17 when I first read my entry into the domain was through A Room of One's Own. So she was a formative figure in my Bildung. So I can never see her as an object or as a possession. I feel very lucky. Now I can study Woolf as a sort of, not a junior scholar, as a mature scholar, but I had to, wait. Because studying Woolf, understanding Woolf, talking about Woolf was not that acceptable, because she's a huge figure, right? Every time you want to say something, people say you're an outsider, you're too young, too old, too this, too that to talk about Woolf, right? But she's always very inspiring. For long years, I did not treat Woolf as a sort of workable subject. She was a surrogate mother, a friend, a family member, a confidant. I'm sure many people feel as I do, because every time I read something about Woolf, a scholarly work on Woolf, I find it very refreshing. So it helps me to, as Maggie also suggested, they all call me into an act of more careful reading. So, and studying Woolf, she stands at the confluence of art and artisanry. She's a writer and a publisher, as Claire suggested, the essayist, daughter, wife, whatnot, reader, co-translator. She even made attempts to translate from Russian, so reader. So we learn diarist, essayist. So one can never become, or one can never see Woolf as a possession. If he or she does, I think the writing will not resonate with anyone. That will be a failure.
I agree.
Yeah, this is my humble opinion.
Thank you. Well, there's another question on YouTube. Şebnem Düzgün asks to Professor G, what is the reason for Angela's initial antagonism towards Woolf? She asked.
Yes, well, all our characters are partly ourselves. And so perhaps there is a little part of me, because my background is so different from Virginia Woolf's, that allowed itself to be expressed through my character. Angela is also a very limited person. She tries, she becomes a better person, I think, through having to look after somebody who is out of her century, out of her own skin, has come back to life, and the friendship between them slowly grows. So the antagonism is a shallow thing because it's a prejudice, isn't it? We have prejudices about the outside features of people. Their accent in Britain is important and ludicrous. We have prejudices about how old they are, perhaps what culture they're from, and what gender they are, what their sexuality is. These are all prejudices. So I show Angela being prejudiced sometimes. I show Virginia Woolf being prejudiced sometimes, but I also show she has great frankness. She will speak openly, as people did in the 20th century, about all sorts of things that we can't. So I was enjoying this mixture of antagonism, of growing love, and that's what fiction's for. Fiction is to examine our prejudices and feelings, examine what we have, and perhaps to grow a little wiser as we do so.
And her question is to Professor Morgan. Why does the novel have the title alluding to Nietzsche, whereas the final chapter is called To the Lighthouse, referring to Woolf?
Very good question. Yes. Well, the different sections of the book have different titles, and one of the central sections is titled A Book for All and None, and that focuses on particularly focuses on the visit to Lake Orta in 1882 that I mentioned in my talk. And A Book for All and None is the sort of subtitle of Thus Spake Zarathustra. And so right at the heart of the book, of the novel, is that book, A Book for All and None section at Lake Orta. But by the end of the novel, the denouement reveals the unexpected connection over and through time between Friedrich Nietzsche in 1882 and Virginia Woolf in 1908. And the particular set of scenes where this is revealed take place at Manorbier, and Virginia Woolf and another character who is intimately connected or part of that connection between Nietzsche and Woolf. That character and Woolf go out in a boat to the lighthouse that is close to Manorbier, just much closer to Manorbier than the lighthouse in St Ives is to the shore. They go out in an idyllic episode in a boat to that lighthouse. So I'm in effect playing on the titles of both the big works by my big characters, A Book for All and None, Nietzsche's work, and To the Lighthouse, Woolf's work. but I'm using those titles also to refer to the actuality of Nietzsche at Lake Orta, sort of starting to call this this work, you know, a book for all and none, and Woolf's very important book, obviously, to the Lighthouse. So I'm using those titles in a variety of ways. So I hope that answers the question. We've lost your sound.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, thank you very much for your answers. Well, we're out of questions now. If you have final comments on Virginia Woolf or on Virginia Woolf scholarship, well, the floor is yours.
Well, I want to thank everyone for making this exciting event possible. Thinking about Woolf, talking about Woolf, that's an endless journey and always inspiring, always rewarding, always promising and always fun. Well, maybe some texts are difficult to read, difficult to understand for us as non-natives, but still, I feel that she wanted to make things easier for us. I mean, fun for us. I believe that. And I hope my students agree with that. There's new scholarship on Woolf. There's always new scholarship on Woolf. Now, Woolf is studied as a global figure. Worldwide Woolf, some of my colleagues, maybe they're following us today, all around the world. There are projects, there are book proposals, book projects about Virginia Woolf as a global writer, as a traveling figure. And I believe that there will be new projects. Maybe we won't be here, but there will always be beautiful, inspiring, affirming, life-affirming projects. Thank you.
Perhaps I could come in and second that view, Mina. Thank you so much, and really to thank everyone for this opportunity to engage in this exciting and very vibrant, I think, event. And an event which sort of explores those very interesting crossover areas between what we call creative writing and what we call academic writing. I think that the focus here in exploring Woolf, not only through her own utterances and the sources, the more academically oriented sources that have written so wonderfully about her, but also it's been a great privilege to be speaking alongside Maggie G. In terms of the lovely coincidence of us both having written novels with Virginia Woolf, you know, as a central character, and to sort of look at the connectivities between our imaginative explorations inside and outside the academy and Woolf's imaginative explorations in the varied ways which the speakers today have been covering. So I think it's been wonderful, and thank you all very much also for such a warm welcome and such an excellent event. So I would now go to Maggie to finish off.
I would second everything that you've said, but I would also really and thank you so much to Ankara and to Bilim University Thank you so much to Professor Dr. Özyurt-Kılıç. Thank you so much to Claire Morgan. But I want to say to the students, read Woolf for yourselves. You will find something wonderful. You will find she will speak to you in a room of one's own, in Professions for Women. She's funny, she's truthful, she's alive. And I think she would want me to end by saying what I said at the end of my reading. Write for your time, write for each other.
I'm really honored to hear such comments, and I want to thank you all for being here with us in this webinar. Thank you very much. I'm really honored by your comments. Thank you. And I think now we can close our webinar. Thank you very much for being here, and thank you very much for listening to this webinar.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Have a nice day. Bye.